In the following 4 videos, I'll give you a brief introduction to each family of the orchestral wind section. Keep in mind that you'll be studying the individual characteristics and roles of these instruments in great detail in the sister course, Orchestration 103, Wind Instruments. Also, the specific ranges, registers, and names of each instrument are cataloged for easy reference in the accompanying PDF, Studying Wind Orchestration. For now, though, what you need is working knowledge of the wind section's general landscape. Please note that often these families have far more members than I can demonstrate, particularly the clarinet family, which has been built in many different tunings and ranges in its role as a band instrument. For this course, I'm focusing only on those instruments you're likely to run across while score reading orchestral music, not to mention staying in the realm of the practical when the time comes for you to score your own arrangements. So let's start at the top of the score with the flute family. Its standard member is called, naturally, the flute, though it's often referred to as the C flute to distinguish it from the alto flute in G. In continental languages, it's also called the large or grand flute. This is in comparison to the piccolo, which is sometimes called the little flute. The standard flute's range is a solid 3 octaves, from middle C upward, plus a note or 2 higher for professional players. Most concert models now also have an extension that reaches a half step lower to B below middle C. The flute is remarkably adept at both a warm type of expression and technical dexterity. Its range and physical size are optimized for the parameters of its construction. That is to say, it plays much more easily than the other members of its family, with nicely spaced finger positions and natural demands on breathing. Every family of winds has its standard member, which represents the baseline of technique, sound, and context for its category. But in the interests of increasing the orchestral range of that particular sound, each family also possesses at least one auxiliary member. These additional instruments have different levels of use in the orchestra, the first level being so common that they appear most of the time, and many players own them. The second level consists of specialist instruments, a bit rarer, but still considered generally essential parts of the ensemble. The third level represents the rarest instruments of all, usually owned by the orchestra rather than the player, and only dusted off every once in a while. The orchestrator cannot depend on the availability of third-level instruments for every orchestra, and should at least confirm the availability of second-level instruments before scoring them. For the flute family, the most common auxiliary is the piccolo. In fact, it's so common that most professional-level orchestral flutists own one, and may be expected to perform on it from time to time, no matter what their seating position. This would qualify the piccolo as a first-level auxiliary. Its range and general characteristics are identical to the flute, only transposed up an octave. It also lacks the flute's bottom 2 notes, starting its range with the second D above middle C. The piccolo shares the flute's technical ease and grace, though it requires more focus to play in its top register, especially on its very highest notes. Its greatest strength of expression and tone mirrors the flute's in the middle of its range. The orchestral flute family has 2 more auxiliary members, trending in the other direction. The first of these has become quite common in modern concert and film scores, the alto flute, or flute in G. As its name suggests, it's a flute that's been scaled somewhat larger, so that its bottom note is G below middle C. Even though this is only an extension of a few notes, the alto flute requires significantly more breath to play, and its added weight can prove tiring to the average flutist's arm. yet it generally shares most of the technical and expressive capabilities of the standard flute, and is scored mostly for the unique beauty of its lower range. The alto flute was often called the bass flute by mistake, and you'll see it indicated as such in some scores. But a true bass flute does exist, transposing down an octave from the standard flute. It's gradually making its way into concert scores, though film composers have been using it for a generation or two. The bass flute is quite difficult to play, requiring even more breath than the alto flute, and the lowest notes for which it's prized are too quiet for anything but the lightest accompaniment by the rest of the orchestra. In a concert orchestra, all the instruments of each wind family are usually covered by 2 to 3 players. The first chair player takes responsibility for all the other players of the same group, and usually covers most of the solo duties. In the case of the flutes, the principal flutist sometimes represents a kind of parallel to the concertmaster of the orchestra, taking responsibility for the entire wind section for questions of organization and phrasing. But generally, each principal of each wind family looks after their own bit of turf, and provides the necessary leadership to keep the group cohesive. Orchestral winds are almost always scored in pairs as a minimum. This means that there will be a second player that supports the first, sometimes doubling a thematic line, forming the lower note of a harmonic interval, alternating patterns to help save breath, or taking over to give the principal some time to catch their breath between demanding solos. This second chair player may also specialize as an auxiliary player in a smaller orchestra, as there are often extra fees which may be charged to represent performance on an extra instrument. Or auxiliary duties may fall to a dedicated third player, leaving the first and second players free to focus on the standard instruments of each wind group. Auxiliary instruments tend to be scored in order of pitch. Flute family scoring, for instance, would naturally place the piccolo above the C flute, and the alto flute below the C flute, while the bass flute would take the bottom position. Some late Romantic era scores place the piccolo on a staff below the flutes, reasoning that since the staff will also be played by the second or third chair flutist, the staff position might as well be the same throughout. However, today's conductors prefer that the piccolo be placed in its logical position, even if that means that the player who covers the instrument will be jumping from one staff in the score to another. Let's jump down the page of score ourselves to the oboes, coming up in the next video.